Okay.
Good to go. Welcome everyone to Denison University's Red Frame Lab Online. This is the third broadcast in a series sponsored by Denison's ReMix Entrepreneurial Conference. We are hosting this session on Zoom and simulcasting on YouTube. My name is Rick Copeland, entrepreneurship coach at Denison University. I'll be making introductions for our guests and moderating their panel today. Today's session will be led by two futurists, Dave Baldwin and David Staley, and they're going to be discussing foresight and the imagination economy. The advent of COVID-19 and ensuing pandemic has meant substantial changes in everyone's lives and businesses on an unprecedented scale. We're still early in our understanding of the impact of these events and what that will mean for us locally and globally. And Dave and David are here to help us see what might be happening in the future months and years. I've had the great fortune of knowing Dave Baldwin and David over the past decade. Dave Baldwin and I first met when we worked with the City of Dublin, Ohio's Economic Development Department on a number of high-profile initiatives over several years. Dave was the driving force behind the city being recognized by the Intelligent Community Forum as a top 7 Intelligent Community of the Year in 2010 and 2011. And his work paved the way for Columbus and the Columbus region being named a top 7 Intelligent Community in 2013, 2014, and 15. Dave has also played a key role in the ideation and establishment of the Dublin Entrepreneurial Center, which is now one of the United States' largest and most successful entrepreneurial centers with over 170 graduates in the past 10 years. 150 of those businesses are still in business, and over 60 have located and continue to grow in the city of Dublin. David Staley and I have known each other for a similar amount of time, and although we have not worked side by side, his impact on our communities is evident across Central Ohio and well beyond. David is the director of the Humanities Institute and associate professor of history at The Ohio State University. He also teaches courses in the Department of Design and the Department of Educational Studies. David is the author of multiple books, most recently, Alternative Universities, Speculative Design for Innovation and Higher Education, which was published by the Johns Hopkins University Press in 2019. Dave's prescient book highlights the need to reimagine education and re-envision the university. Crisis is an accelerator. Our current crisis has intensified the pressures on higher education and simultaneously enhanced the opportunities education's leaders have today. They should be asking, what if? This is right in line with our Red Frame Lab approach of what does this make possible? Denison is leading during this time of upheaval and uncertainty and serving students, faculty, staff, alumni, and our broader communities. How we take action now is setting the conditions for our future opportunities and successes. We are intentionally asking, what does this make possible, rather than dwell on how difficult this time is on so many fronts. We're going to hear from our guests, David Baldwin and Dave Staley, in just a moment, but first a bit of housekeeping. Everyone is muted for those joining on Zoom, and please use the chat feature at the bottom of your screen to ask questions or jump in with the raise of a hand. Melissa Treese is moderating questions today, and she can call on you to ask your questions or share your thoughts. Dave and David will answer as many questions as possible. We are recording this and will make it available to everyone on Denison's YouTube channel. Over the past few weeks, we've had 2 other sessions, one on the CARES Act and payroll protection, which has had over 160 views on YouTube, as well as a session with Allison Nissen and Marcy Stout, the co-founders of Rebel Coach, who shared their thoughts on what crisis makes possible. That recorded live stream has been viewed over 100 times. We have other ReImagine online sessions scheduled, and one is this Friday at noon, discussing how businesses and entrepreneurs are adjusting to the current climate. It's a perfect follow-on to today's session. Please join us for that. We'll have a few other conversations before the summer begins. And lastly, before we get started, please know that Dave and David will be providing their contact information at the end of the session. And with that, Dave and David, welcome to ReMix ReImagine Online.
Thank you very much, Rick. And thank you for the invitation to share our thoughts with your ReMix Summit attendees. Good afternoon to all. When Rick and I were discussing the Denison ReMix Summit Online, we agreed that with all that is unfolding in the world, discussion on the future and the need for foresight might be useful. And I automatically wanted to team this event with my good friend and colleague, David Staley, who is also the head of the Columbus Futurist Group, of which I've been a member for many, many years. One of the things I wanted to do was ask David to start us off in terms of sort of a brief overview of this whole notion of foresight, and the term that we futurists use almost more often than the future perspective is the notion of tools for foresight and how we look ahead at what's coming down the pike. David?
Thanks very much, Dave, and thanks for the invitation, Rick. Dave has probably used some sort of version of this, but anytime I give a talk on foresight, or anytime I'm asked to think about the future, the first thing I tell an audience is anybody that stands in front of you and says they can predict the future is lying to you, or maybe lying to themselves. And I think it all sort of hinges on that idea of prediction and predict. And I know I'm going to sound like a hopeless academic, but I think the subject here is not academic. When I say we can't predict, I guess I need to walk that back just a little bit. So there are some things that we can predict, actually with a fair amount of certainty. I can say with a fair amount of confidence that it's going to be cold here in Columbus next January. But those aren't the sorts of things that interest us about the future. The things that interest us are the things that are, by definition, unpredictable. And I think that describes the bulk of our world. The bulk of our world is unpredictable. And without getting sort of too technical, the reason for that is that those of us that engage in foresight, those of us that think about the future, are really interested in what are called complex adaptive systems. What I oftentimes say is when someone asks me, what's the future of, whatever, what's the future of retail, what's the future of the banking sector, whatever the case is, what they're really asking is, they want to know what's the future state of some system going to be at point X in the future. And the sorts of things that we want to know about tend to be these complex adaptive systems. Where the sort of the individual parts, the individual components of the system interact in such a way that emergent behaviors are a very frequent possibility. You've heard of the butterfly principle, right? The butterfly flapping its wings in West Africa disturbs the air such that eventually a hurricane is produced that impacts the other side of the Atlantic. Well, the thing that's not usually talked about in the butterfly effect is that the butterfly could flap its wings and then nothing happens. That's the nature of complex adaptive systems. We can't know with certainty what the effects are going to be. And the other thing about the butterfly effect is that a small change, a butterfly flapping its wings, can create huge effects way outside the small effects that cause them. That's the context then for thinking about the future. That's the context for thinking about foresight, that the things that we're interested in are by definition unpredictable. So if we're not predicting, what are we doing? Most futurists work with scenarios, and a scenario is one story or one narrative about a possible future. And I've been using the plural there because futurists tend to think about scenarios in the plural. This could happen, this could happen, this could happen. We tend to think in terms of 3 or 4 scenarios in any given case. I just wrote a piece that was published this week, my column for Columbus Underground. It's called Next, and I was talking about the future of essential workers after COVID-19. What's the future of essential workers? And I laid out 3 possible scenarios, 3 possible directions that future might go. So so when all of this is by way of saying, we as futurists tend not to think in terms of prediction, because a prediction assumes that the future is already in existence someplace. And all we have to do is sort of point to it and wait for time and events to sort of catch up with that. The future hasn't been formed yet. And so we use other kinds of techniques to think about the future. Dave, we might have a slide that shows a couple of these.
Yeah, I have a couple of those. One is I wanted to introduce the notion of what we call the Cone of Foresight. And it's,
yes, sir.
to David's point is exactly, if you look at the time frame there, is from now moving farther and farther out, things become less predictable or projectable, less possible, and in some cases that some futures farther out even become preposterous. So the notion of a beginning point looking out is, when we look at foresight, we begin to do near term, and then the farther out we go, the less predictable those things are, and the less we can count on the reliability of those things. If you're a fan of Back to the Future, Emmett Brown talks about going back from the future and changing events, and that you create an alternative new future. That's exactly what happens. Is if events in the now, like the pandemic, change things drastically, then the cone gets readjusted, not only for time frame, but scope of activities that are contained within that scope. So we're in a period now where, and it's been funny, I've watched commercials or anything now, there are commercials that are totally irrelevant anymore because of the way they project things that are pre-pandemic, and therefore they will never be like that again. So people are going to have to readjust their advertising. To David's other point, in the notion of tools that we futurists use in terms of foresight and futuring methods, these are just a few. And as you can see, scenarios is another one we could add to that. But the notion of scanning the universe for what kinds of trends are out there, brainstorming, modeling, gaming, and now with artificial intelligence and virtual reality kinds of technology capabilities, we've got more tools in our toolbox to do that. And how do I?
The only thing also to
go ahead.
So the only thing I'll conclude with that, and I think we'll come back to this a little bit later, and this was also embedded in the title of our symposium today, is the idea of imagination. As futurists, as people that engage in foresight, as Dave suggests here, we have fairly rigorous methods. A big part of what we do is, for instance, environment scanning. I spend a fair amount of my time sort of scanning all kinds of sources for just changes in the environment. But I think a big part of what we engage in is the imagination. And I'm not afraid to say that. And as I say, I think we'll come back to this theme later. But a big part of what we do as futurists is engage in the imagination. And that is going to be a skill that will be in great demand, I think, in our economy going forward. We'll come back to imagination at a later point.
So, as Rick introduced the session, what does this make possible?
Mm-hmm. Dave, I have a quick question for you. We were unable to see your screen a moment ago, so the screen share on your side, for whatever reason, didn't work. So if you want to bring those slides up again, please do so. But gentlemen, I do have a question for you.
Is that there?
That now we can see them. Was the COVID-19 global pandemic a black swan event that no one saw coming?
David?
Absolutely not. Absolutely
That's
not a black swan.
word.
Well, and I understand where the question is coming from, Rick, because I mean, I've heard that a lot in the media. And I think the term black swan obviously gets thrown around a great deal. Dave, do you have the book there in front of you, Taleb's book?
I have the definition of a black swan.
The definition.
Nassim Taleb.
Yeah, Nassim Taleb wrote a book, oh gosh, probably about 8 years or so ago now, that coined the term black swan. And he has a very specific definition of what a black swan is.
A black swan is an unpredictable event that is beyond what is normally expected of a situation and has potentially severe consequences. Black swan events are characterized by their extreme rarity, their severe impact, and the widespread insistence that they were obvious in hindsight.
Yeah. So he called them black swans because of an event that occurred in 18th century Europe. Europeans were, well, they're not even convinced. They just knew for a fact that swans are white. They are no other color but white. And then when Europeans encountered, in fact, a black swan, this was an inconceivable reality for them. And so a big part of Taleb's definition of a black swan is that it is a scenario that has, you know, great consequence, but one that's not even imaginable. And he's a statistician, a mathematician, and a statistician. He's thinking in sort of statistical terms here. So to the question, is COVID-19 a black swan event? That explains my rather strong reaction, because this was an event that many futurists did in fact foresee. And I can, you know, give you all sorts of instances of this. I'll just sort of recount personally. I mentioned I write a monthly column for Columbus Underground on the future called Next. Can I put in that plug? Next, Columbus Underground. But 2 years ago, it was almost exactly 2 years ago, my column was called "What If There Were Another Pandemic?" And I sort of laid out a scenario for what a global pandemic might look like and its consequences. And that's been getting, you know, lots of people coming back to me saying, "Wow, how prescient you were." But you know, Bill Gates gave a TED talk about this. We've already heard in the news that the outgoing Obama administration had prepared contingency plans for the incoming administration about the pandemic. There was a great deal of foresight already in place about this. So I'd have to come up with another term than black swan to describe this event. Dave, you want to add anything to that, or?
Just that the pandemic of 1918, if you want to go back that far, certainly was a precursor that it was possible and that it could happen. It's been 100 years since then, so a lot of people didn't know about it or don't remember it. And also many people didn't project that moving forward, that because it had happened before, that it might happen again.
Interesting.
Right. And things are different. It's 100 years later, and, you know, we're a lot smarter, and, you know, we understand public health better. That was sort of one of the arguments. But Dave is quite right to point to the 1918 pandemic. You can even go back further in history if you want. There have been we've been living with pandemics for, well, as long as there's been civilization, I suppose. But it's a good question to ask, Rick.
Okay. So given that, I can understand why 100 years ago or several hundred years ago, the world would be unprepared for something like this. But why did we not better prepare for a foreseeable event like this?
I'm going to start on
yeah, please, Dave, go ahead.
Arrogance, in one sense, is that we think we know the way things will go. And I think there was a belief in our medical system that we had already taken care of things that we needed to be inoculated against. And so there was this just this impression that we were impervious to something this big. I think also with that in mind, with technologies of today, we also really couldn't imagine something that could simultaneously occur in a global basis. David?
Yeah, just to go off on that, I agree with especially the arrogance part. I'll take a more charitable approach, but not too charitable, because I think we saw something like this after 9/11. We saw similar kinds of hand wringing about this, or an even a more recent example would be Hurricane Katrina. In fact, Hurricane Katrina, a Category 5 hurricane striking New Orleans, downtown New Orleans, was something that was foreseen in the pages of the Times-Picayune newspaper. 3 years before that, they ran a five-day or week-long series. Here's what happened. Here's what's going to happen when a Category 5 hurricane hits New Orleans. And on Wednesday, here's what happens when that levee is going to break. So there were lots of people who saw it, and the question was, so why wasn't anything done about it? Because, well, what had been done was to spend billions, for instance, on levee protection and building up the infrastructure on an event that maybe had a high probability of occurring, but not a certainty of occurring. And there were a number of people in New Orleans and in Louisiana state government that said, well, look, we have to spend money on schools or on, you know, police and fire. You know, we can't take money from those things and switch it over to levee protection until
It
in
wasn't a
hindsight, it's
priority at
easy.
the time.
Exactly. It wasn't a priority at the time. So one could make the charitable argument that we just didn't want to prioritize the public health infrastructure. That was in the scenario I wrote 2 years ago. That was one of my load-bearing assumptions. That one of the things that would mitigate a pandemic, at least in the United States, is our robust public health infrastructure, especially around the CDC. But then I also noted in that piece, but I also see how the CDC's funds have been cut, and that's a worrying sign. So there are political and other sorts of dimensions to this. Decisions have to be made, and other choices mitigated. Though I think Dave's response might be the more cogent one.
It seems like we're making trade-off decisions around potential events like this at any given time. And so the idea of preparing for black swan events is really, how are we going to invest our time and effort now in order to compensate for a potential future event? Is that right?
I would clarify that by very nature of definition, we can't prepare for a black swan event, and therefore this wasn't one. We could have prepared better for the pandemic.
Gotcha.
Because it was not a black swan event. But to prepare for a black swan event, or the notion that there are some types of black swan events we might imagine we should prepare for, is frivolous, because you just don't know where that next thing is coming.
Fair enough. All right, so gentlemen, how about this? As futurists, what are the global, national, and local implications and impacts of this pandemic? What are the obvious ones that I think we would probably all go, oh yeah, and what are some of the subtle ones that we may not be seeing right now?
I'll start off. It's interesting. There is a diametrically opposed events and impacts that have happened. One is, this has been a great equalizer globally. Is nations now that are powerful and nations that are not so powerful have been reduced to equal status, of that this pandemic is affecting all. And there are a number of implications of that, even in societies where wealthy people are getting this and poor people are getting this, so that it has equalized participation, even to the extent that you see movie stars or the late night talk shows, or everybody's broadcasting from home like we are right now.
Right now.
Because we're not allowed to be where we all used to be. The interesting thing, though, is on the other side of that, is that it is exposing and disrupting systems that were very fragile already, but that we weren't paying attention to that. So we are exposing great disparities in wealth, great disparities in healthcare, great disparities in society. So it is magnifying some of those distances, some of those systems that were very fragile, but we weren't paying attention to them because we really didn't have a consequence to that, and we do now. So those are two observations I have of impact, and then we can get more granular. There's some really interesting ones. I would just outline, and for David to tee him up, is all the different sectors. You name a sector, it's been impacted. So government, education, healthcare, finance, environment, community, business, civic systems. One thing that's key in all of these is uncertainty now. David?
Yeah. No, I don't disagree at all, David. And Rick, I think the way you framed the question is correct. That there are sort of micro level effects that I think, and they extend all the way up to the global, the geopolitical, even the environmental. One of the things that we've noticed, for instance, is CO2 emissions have declined. Not dramatically, but there has been a decline. And I'm sure everyone has seen some of the images around cities around how smog has been lifted. That is, I think, going to, well, I don't know if it's going to solve the debate around climate change, but I think it's certainly going to be sort of an ammunition to those sort of that have been arguing for, you know, the whole scientific consensus that talks about the effect of human behavior, human actions on climate. And that's one of the things that I've been tracking is what are going to be the long-term effects on things like governance. Dave was just talking about the disparities that that COVID-19 has uncovered. I think one of these things is about governance. For going on 40 years now, part of the debate in this country has been about, you know, reducing government, reducing the size of government, reducing the footprint of government. And I think that if anything, this event has sort of demonstrated why there is government. And I think in some ways we're fortunate to be in Ohio, where our leaders have, I think, acted calmly, rationally, with scientific rigor. But we've seen places where that's not been the case. But I think it's also sort of uncovered. So this is what it means when you have weak government. And we can maybe contrast that with what we're seeing in some other nations, where the results of government, and we're not talking about policy, we're just talking about good government. Look at New Zealand, look at South Korea, look at Germany, and look at the role and function of good government and efficient government in these cases. My question, I think a key uncertainty is that going to sort of reverse the trend toward sort of anti-government bias? I think not, but I think that there's a real strong possibility there. I mentioned my latest column where I was talking about essential workers. I think that that this is a disparity that COVID-19 has uncovered. That the people that we are now calling essential workers are also some of the lowest paid, least respected workers in our society. And right now they're being called heroes. The question is, what happens after the COVID-19 crisis? Will the people working at Kroger, will the stockers at Amazon, will we still call them heroes and treat them accordingly? Or will they sort of slip back into their pre-COVID-19 patterns?
I think what you mentioned there, David, sorry to interrupt, but along that point, that supports the great equalization. And time will tell on the other side how those services are valued. But what we're already seeing is that those players now have more leverage and more stock in beginning to reduce the inequities that I said earlier were apparent or were already present, but we weren't paying attention to them. So businesses are now having to face things like healthcare and sick time and increased wages and a family wage, because those people and their importance in systems have been elevated, that even the biggest systems fell apart when the least of us wasn't doing our job. So that we're really examining worth, we're really examining value, and we're spreading that out across a new way of examining relevance and importance in organizations and respect in organizations that I think is going to be very interesting, but very healthy in the long term. I think it's going to change the structure of organizations and the way we do business too.
I absolutely agree. I'll just sort of conclude the thought by saying that one of the things I'm tracking around COVID-19 is how this will accelerate some trends that we were already seeing before, and that that's something I might have thought was 10 or 15 years out might now be, say, 5 years out. And so one of these, for instance, is automation. I think that certainly one of the things we're seeing right now around essential workers is that some of those jobs are being replaced by robots. So we're seeing robots being used, for instance, to clean and disinfect public spaces that a human being would have done. We're seeing drones being used to enforce social distancing in parks and other sort of public places. I wonder if COVID-19 becomes an accelerant toward greater automation. I think another thing I'm tracking, and again, I don't know what the outcome of this is, but we were watching sort of a US-Chinese sort of Cold War emerging. And I think that the response to and sort of global leadership around COVID-19 is up for grabs here. And I'm already sort of, we're already sort of watching a clash there between sort of U.S. and Chinese leadership. And if I were making a bet today, there are many commentators, not just me, that are sort of saying the Chinese might be winning. I don't think that they have won, but I think that that's a geopolitical trend that we need to be watching as well.
Rick,
I hope I'm wrong about that one, but I don't think I am.
Rick, another one that when we talk about the tools for foresight and discussions you and I have had, one of the things that's interesting is, I don't know how you do it again, but that you incorporate the essence of this phenomena for the first time in unison, for certain the country, just because it happened across the world, but a global event that happened simultaneously, but certainly in the United States, we shut down on a certain date. And what I've observed in systems is that I'm seeing, especially in higher ed or in businesses, that people were forced to immediately have to cope with a disruption to their system at the same time, which also meant, for instance, I've been in consulting in higher ed and telling them for a long time that their world is going to be disrupted. But individually, my clients wouldn't believe it because they always thought it was the other guy that was going to go away. What happened when higher ed shut down on March 1st and said, we'll open back up on March 31st. I said, no, you won't. You better get used to this. It's going to be a long, long time. But the unions of faculty or students or parents or sports teams, whatever it was, couldn't blame an administrative, maybe you're just holding back the budget, or maybe you're just doing this because you want to reshift the system. There was no motivation. It was, this happened to all of us at the same time. And it is now causing people to have to immediately move into innovative systems thinking without malice. Here it is. We got to deal with it. We're now all aligned together in examining the core business. And if I could, as a tool, why I mentioned the tool for foresight, if I could recapture with clients the ability to shut them down, like not tell them, but make sure everybody was safe, but say, I'm going to shut you down for a week, totally, tomorrow, and just see what they do, their innovation capacity would go through the roof.
Yes, I've seen that in all of my clients as well. And so as you are talking about kind of the microeconomic impacts of this, on an individual basis or a group basis, where some jobs are gone forever. Some jobs may come back for a while. We're going to innovate our way out of those. So we're really trending into a position of drastic changes in not only in our economy, but in the global economy as a whole. And so I'm curious, David, when you alluded to the imagination economy earlier, what did you mean by that?
So I talked first of all about imagination and just sort of the status of imagination. And when I say imagination to audiences, especially business audiences, they always give me funny looks because we associate imagination. It's either something that a poet or a philosopher or a liberal arts major does, but it's not, or better still, it's something that like little kids engage in, right? And we oftentimes, just think about the way we talk about imagination in just sort of daily talk. We'll oftentimes say, don't let your imagination get away with you. And again, some imagination is what little kids do. But my sense is that imagination is going to be one of those important, frankly, leadership skills of the next economy. I was saying that before COVID-19. I think COVID-19 just makes it ever more necessary, I think. Dave, you had a slide there about imagination. And also there's a piece that just came out in Harvard Business Review that was talking about the importance of imagination for business. Can you share those, Dave? Or there we go. Yes. So that just appeared in Harvard Business Review. And if you scroll down a little bit, they have a wonderful sort of definition there of imagination. Yeah, right there. We believe imagination, the capacity to create, evolve, and exploit mental models of things or situations that don't yet exist, is the crucial factor in seizing and creating new opportunities, finding new paths to growth. That to me sounds an awful lot like entrepreneurship. And the way I'm sort of phrasing it is to be an unimaginative entrepreneur doesn't make any sense to me. And so I think we're going to come to value imagination as a key leadership skill and ability. The reason I've been saying this all along is I've been paying a lot of attention to automation, and that automation is going to replace, frankly, a lot of skills that human beings possess, and not just simply physical skills. It's going to be a lot of mental skills. But no one has developed the algorithm yet that has an imagination, that can visualize that which doesn't exist yet. That is our ability. And so I think that the cultivation of imagination becomes the key innovation skill.
Just to piggyback,
and as I say, futures engage in imagination. Sorry, Dave.
No, just to move that along, there's a book written called Imagination First, and it's by Eric Liu and Scott Nope Marshall. And I worked with Scott Nope Marshall and that notion of imagination first, because they use imagination as part of a trilogy of imagination, creativity, and innovation, but that always imagination comes first. Is that notion of it hasn't existed before, and that we conceptualize or make that up in our mind. And once we have done that, then we can move towards drawing it or bringing it to life in creativity. And then when we capitalize on that and make innovations with that, that completes the cycle. But that it really does begin with imagination. And that notion right now is we're being tested, but we're also being given the opportunity, because so many people are being affected in so many ways that they never imagined, that we have to imagine new ways of doing everything very quickly.
Rick, you were very kind to put a plug in for the book that I just published. Thank you. A big part of that, so what I did in the book was to imagine 10 different models for how we could redesign universities. None of these are universities that exist. I imagined 10 new models. And part of the reaction, it's not been the complete reaction, but I've had some, well, I can't really call it blowback. I've had some people say, boy, some of these ideas are really crazy. What's your response to that? You have some really crazy ideas. And the first thing I say is, well, I don't think we use that word anymore. And second, what makes an idea crazy? Does it mean that it's implausible? Does it mean that it would be difficult to put into place? What is it that makes an idea or a piece of imagination crazy? And again, we don't use that word. And that's sort of part of what I'm talking about, the sort of reaction we have to imagination. There are those that it's too easy to put up roadblocks and constraints on our thinking. And those who are truly imaginative, especially in organizations, sometimes find it hard going.
I couldn't agree with you more, David. And I think when you mentioned a minute ago that entrepreneurs really are equivalent to imagination, I couldn't agree more with that either. The whole gist of what we're doing this series for is to ask, what does this make possible? And to me, that's where entrepreneurs really begin to play a role, and to not be futurists, but to take what they're seeing in the world and ask that question: what is this? How does this make good things possible? Because it does make good things possible. And so I'm curious, you know, as we're looking out, as both of you guys are looking out over the next several months, what are some of the good impacts that can or may happen out of all of this right now?
I can say that, and I've observed an appreciation for humanity, is the fragility of life. We have no idea where this virus is and where it's lurking, but our distancing and our ability, our required isolation has, if I've heard it once, whether it's on NPR or in any discussion, is people's hunger for hugging or for touch. And those pieces of us as humans are being tested very, very well. So a positive side of that is a value of our humanity, and that no machine or no vehicle or anything has the ability to replace the essence of what we are as a society. And I think we're going to get back to how do we recapture the notion of connectivity to each other and a respect for each other's presence and humanity and worth that's coming out of this.
I'll put on my hat as a higher education strategy consultant and say that so I think our initial reaction, was kind of slow, as Dave was suggesting, that higher education was saying, well, we'll just wait till the end of March and everything will be sort of hunky-dory, back to normal. And that just simply isn't going to be the case. And so the reaction right now in higher education has been, we're going to have to move everything online because that's where the trend is going, or we're going to have to close up shop, which has been the other thing that we're seeing. And I argued that this is actually, we could use this as an opportunity to refashion, reimagine, redesign our institutions of higher learning. And this is what I've been doing in my higher education strategy consulting, saying, look, your choices are not just move everything online or shutter. You have other choices, other options as well. Not all of them I lay out in the book, but there are other possibilities open here. One of the things that we're seeing, for instance, is that students are not crazy about online learning. They're not. This is not their preference, and so I think the default settings as well. We'll just move everything online and everything will be fine. I think is actually going to run into a lot of problems. So I don't think of higher education as necessarily an environment where there's lots of entrepreneurs, but I think entrepreneurs could very, very quickly and effectively move into this space.
Okay, so I do want to leave room for questions for the people that we do have on Zoom with us today. But I do have one other question that I want to ask that's a follow-on to that.
Sure.
So we've agreed that this pandemic is not a black swan event, and we can reasonably project that there's probably going to be others. There may be other hurricanes, there will be earthquakes around the world, these things that we can be prepared for. It seems to me that it's against human nature to just prepare for all of these things, regardless whether we live in the epicenter or not. And so how do we encourage individuals and organizations to act on what is a reasonable expectation for radical events and maybe even radical ideas, and rather than to suppress or ignore them until it happens and then compensate?
One of the things I advocate for with organizations with whom I'm consulting or presenting is integrating this process of foresight into the fabric of the structure of their organization on an ongoing basis. David and I get asked and get hired to be keynote speakers at conferences, and it's almost like we're a party trick. Bring in the futurist once a year to wow us about the things flying cars and all that kind of stuff. But what I'd rather see, and what frustrates me, is over my career, if I've been told once, I've been told 1,000 times, you told us that 5 years ago. I said, yes, but did you listen then when it was not standard practice? And one organization, as an association, I said, why are you bringing me in? Because all the research I had to do for my keynote address is I got to know their business really well. And our staff had done all kinds of research. And there I was presenting to the people who I thought were supposed to be the ones in their industry to be telling their members what's coming. I said, why am I telling you what's going to happen in your business? This is nuts. It's because you haven't taken the steps to build into your process, looking forward enough to build that in. So you have a human resource committee, you have a finance committee. Why don't you have a foresight and futures committee? Why don't you have, so that's where action begins. But then it really has to be integrated into our leadership framework that begins to not punish people for taking risks or for supporting those investments in what David called crazy things. And they may not work, but we have to encounter those. We have to act on those, because there are so many examples right now of tragedies that have happened because we knew they were coming, but we didn't act on them. And we have to have the courage of action.
That's well stated, Dave. So I apologize having to be on my phone. I had slides and other things that I would be able to share, but I had sort of computer issues. So I jotted here a really quick. I don't know how well you can see this. Can you see that diagram I just drawn?
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
So I call it imagination management. So I create a quadrant where the axes are impact and sort of probability. And those X's on there are different scenarios, different images of the future. And so in addition to sort of dreaming them up, so I mentioned the 3 scenarios that I put in place for the future of essential workers. The next step, it would be to sort of place those different scenarios in this space based on their probability, how likely is it to occur, and their impact. How big of an impact is this going to be? If a scenario I come up with is in that sort of that upper right quadrant, high impact, high probability, if you're an organization, then you need to be acting upon that. You absolutely need to be acting upon that. But the other thing I point out is that the other scenarios, even though they might be in the low probability or the low impact portion of that diagram, this diagram isn't static. In other words, those different scenarios can shift over time. What was low probability of occurring today in 5 years might now seem high probability. And so you have to sort of constantly revisit them. So I consider that area here around the other sort of 3/4 of this, I call that strategic peripheral vision. You keep those on your peripheral vision. You don't necessarily have to act on them today, but in the same way that we have ocular peripheral vision to sort of be aware of things over here. I don't have to act, if I'm driving, I don't have to act on something that's over here until it's now part of my my ocular vision. And it's the same with strategy, I think. There are things that are right now on the margin, and I can be aware of them, but need to be ready to act on them. And the reason I call it imagination management is, well, one, to tie it to the idea of imagination economy, but also as a way to manage all the different possibilities that we can imagine. After 9/11, this is something that we saw in the Homeland Security sector, the Homeland Security space. There were so many possibilities, so many ideas about what terrorists could be doing to us that managing them and how to act was seemingly impossible. And so I was at a conference with a number of people in this space, and I said, this is the way you should be thinking about these different possibilities. Don't get fixated on this low probability, low impact possibility when you've got this high probability, high impact thing that could happen tomorrow. Use this as a way to manage your imagination.
I really like that. One more question before we open it up to any audience questions. I think that what you're saying, David, is that this is a great tool for people who are in positions of planning to use, and they can use this proactively, but they need to use it with their own imagination and their own intelligence so that their attention is focused on those things that are highly likely and may happen with a greater degree of reliability. So how do you encourage leadership groups to deal with the situation where we have right now? Let's say we're looking forward to the fall. We don't know what that's going to mean for business. There's a whole lot of variables that will change and come into play over the next weeks and months that will impact decisions and the decisions that will be made. So how do leaders take this information that's all kind of up in the air and begin to make plans where they can, say, oh, that's plan 1A or that's plan 6C. How do leaders do that in your world?
I'm going to jump in on that one.
Hire foresight consultants. Sorry.
There are a couple of things that I think are really critical to that, Rick. One is the power of questions. And I use this a lot. And I think that people are looking for right answers, or the notion that there is a right answer out and we just have to figure out how to find it. I think we have to really get good with our teams and as a leader in encouraging right questions. So back to David's paradigm there, I was going to add, one question you should always be asking is, what's the consequence of not acting? When we were saying, how do we encourage people to act? And I think we need to imagine that scenario of what might happen if it's in a high probability area. What's the consequence of doing nothing? In some cases, that may be a preferred option. In other cases, it could be devastating. So I think in terms of how we begin to look at what the fall might bring for all of us, we have to gather data. We have to trust the data and the science. But I think we need to ask questions then of, if those are that, back to that cone of probability, if these are this is the way things are shaking out. One other thing I wanted to add, and this will ruffle David's feathers in the higher ed sphere. One of the things that people aren't considering enough in that scenario he painted about whether things will open up in the fall and about online learning and moves to that. What I didn't hear him say was that there might be a discovery that higher ed as we know it is not necessary, because we haven't asked the question, have we really changed how we learn? And have we invited others to the party now of a dialogue of learning models may be different, and from whom we learn may be different? And I'll take it out of his sphere so he doesn't get a little cranky on me. But transportation. So United Airlines is saying this is going to be 4 years out, and we're going to have to, they're rethinking how about flights and middle seats when they may need to rethink how the plane is shaped. We might need to think about alternative transportation systems and the way why we went where we went before and how we get there. I don't think our questions at this wonderful time of challenge and this wonderful time of total disruption, we have to open up our minds to totally new solutions that don't presuppose that in our arrogance, we all need to be part of that next solution.
Well said. So I'm going to ask Melissa if we have any questions that people have asked during this, or if anybody wants to ask a question now. Let's open that up and see what kind of good questions we get.
We don't have any current questions in our chat, but if anyone had a question, you could just jump in right now and ask.
I have a question. Hi, it's Leslie. And thank you, Rick and David. I have a question about instilling creative thinking skills with children and young people. And I'm becoming a lot more aware of the importance of this as a critical skill. And I'm starting to see some pretty interesting opportunities to encourage children at a young age to think in out of the box ways. And I'm curious, examples being, I know of maker spaces where young adolescents are encouraged to create projects with their hands to get off of their lifestyle that is so focused, or can be so focused, on technology. And you see maker spaces in college environments, and there's such a change in the workforce. And I'm curious, you talk about imagination and creativity. I'm curious what your perspective is on those opportunities to encourage and incubate creative thinking.
I would immediately go to, and we've done this with young people, is questions, is asking them to imagine, to dream. What if why are things the way they are, or what might they look like if they were different, and how might you redo something, and then let them go, and don't judge the answer that they give you as being not acceptable or not within the frame of reality. I think sometimes we stifle imagination in young people because we kind of guide them that it doesn't fit within our world. It is crazy, but that serendipity is really where creativity comes from, and letting them let the answer be what the answer is from their point of view. They trust then that you're going to let them, you really do want to hear what their answer is.
Well, and I'm going to sound sort of a pessimistic note, because I like the way that you answered that, Dave. I think the current, so if I'm looking at the K through 12 world, I think the current system just simply isn't set up for that. Under the testing regime that so many school children have to labor under, the creativity is just simply not conducive to that sort of setting. So that's one whole set of challenges. By the time you get into higher education, where does one actually learn creativity? You mentioned maker spaces and those sorts of things. But I'm talking about, for instance, majoring in creativity, majoring in imagination, saying that these are that creativity and imagination are on par with STEM. But at the moment, it's STEM that sort of dominates our thinking. And part of the reason it dominates our thinking is the perception that if I am in a STEM discipline, that's my path to career success. If I were to say to a young person, think creativity, think imagination as your path to career success, they'd look at me as a doddering old man, I think. And so I think that there would have to be a lot of systematic changes in place to bring this about. And it's not just simply schools and universities. I think that that young people would need to be hearing this from corporations, from leaders, from politicians, from others. I think that there are huge structural changes that would need to be in place first.
I would recommend any book by Sir Ken Robinson in the notion of creativity and education. And he's part of an organization I'm a member of called the National Creativity Network. And he's got phenomenal examples of how, and great presentations on YouTube. Some of them are the most watched YouTube presentations, is Sir Ken Robinson's work on is education killing creativity in children? And there's some great YouTube videos and RSA Animate animations of his presentation, and I think you'd find it really valuable for working with kids.
I came across a local space actually that I thought was a crafts studio for children, and learning a little bit more. Right now it's in a period of shutdown, but it's essentially a bright and clean place for children to go and experiment with textiles and fabrics and various materials in a studio for really, and allow them just to kind of expand on that as a side activity, which is a wonderful opportunity. And I'm starting to see there's just a lot of interest in providing this kind of opportunity to children earlier and better, in light of the fact that this is the first generation that's been raised almost exclusively on a diet of technology. And there's a lot of opportunity as it relates to connecting with the natural world too. So I'm starting to see nonprofits do good work by connecting in with, in collaborative sense with other organizations to do good, and very creative unfolding of good ideas.
Another piece, partnering with a firm out of Mississippi right now, and we're exploring and implementing virtual reality. virtual reality headsets and its application in education. In fact, my partner down there who has the company that works with that has been asked to create an entire school system, not just a class, but a school system in light of what's happened with the pandemic. And what they're finding in creating virtual reality classrooms and things like that is absolutely phenomenal. And from the distance, I have granddaughters in Minnesota and they're locked in and out of school. So I sent an Oculus headset to them and connected them to resources in the virtual world for education and for travel so that they could get out of the house without leaving the house. So that VR world is emerging as another place where creativity is really, the kids are doing some really cool things.
Yep. I think we have time for one more question. And I think somebody else turned their camera on, so I'm guessing that means there might be a question coming.
Yes, I have a question. As undergrad students, how can we rethink our majors, like post COVID-19? What skills should we learn that would help us after coronavirus?
Dave, you have 30 seconds. No, I'm just kidding.
David, go ahead.
In fact, I don't think you have to wait post COVID-19. So I was honored this year to deliver the opening convocation address at the President's Convocation in Ohio State, and I titled my talk "Future-Proof Your Education," and I was talking about the fact that automation. I was talking a lot about automation. That if you really want to future-proof your education, you should be cultivating uniquely human abilities and skills, and not the things that could be easily replicated by AI and robots and autonomous intelligence. And so that's the things we've been talking about here: cultivating creativity, imagination, wonder, storytelling, all the things that are sort of the uniquely human attributes. That, again, these things already sort of exist in higher education, but we tend to shunt them off the side and say, oh, well, that's the arts and humanities, that's those things over there. And we know those people never get jobs. I actually think the future belongs to those folks.
I would also encourage you to form unlikely partnerships and diverse partnerships of hanging around people that aren't like you, especially.
That's an excellent suggestion.
One of the things, I'm reading the book right now because it actually mirrors my career, but it's called Range. And it's the notion of that starting a career out from scratch and pursuing it all the way through life, rather than coming through a number of different careers till you find what they call, or what he calls, the match quality of your match to that career. Is it may take your lifetime. But what they found is those people that were matched eventually, but that had many diverse careers prior to that, were much more effective at their careers than people who were dedicated to their careers and into super specializations. Innovation happened better when you had broader life and career experiences. So in one sense, Hassan, I would say just start. And when it doesn't make sense anymore, change. But also I would form unlikely partnerships with bringing people together in the conversation under the category you're in your major. But don't just hang around people in your major, bring new ideas into that.
Excellent.
Thank you.
Well, Deno, we are bumping up against our hour. We've run up past that, as a matter of fact. Could I get both of you to tell us how others can reach out to you via email or your websites, so that they do have contact after this if they want to go deeper with the ideas, or actually employ you as futurists to help them to move forward?
Go ahead, David.
An easy way is columbus.futurists.org. columbus.futurists.org.
And mine is www.aquarian, as in the zodiac sign, AQUARIAN, Aquarian, sys.com, that sys.com. And my email is dbaldwin@aquariansys.com.
All right, gentlemen, thank you so much for leading us through this discussion today. I found it utterly fascinating. Leslie, Hassan, thank you for asking questions. I wish we had more time for questions. We're trying to keep this close to an hour if at all possible. I do want to encourage people to join us on Friday, as this will be the Friday session with the entrepreneurs will be a great follow on today, because they're dealing with these very questions. How do we move forward with our businesses with what we know today? And I think it's going to be fascinating. I've encouraged everybody to watch your inbox for a message regarding a replay of today's discussion for the YouTube link, and also watch your inbox for information on upcoming discussions. We have several lined up over the next few weeks, and we're currently working out schedules with the presenters and panelists to make those work efficiently. I just want to say thank you for joining us today. Again, I'm Rick Copeland. I get to be the entrepreneur coach at Denison University's Red Frame Lab, where we explore design thinking, innovation, and entrepreneurship with Denison students, faculty, and staff. And I'm going to leave you with a parting thought of encouragement for everyone today. And I want everyone to just simply keep asking, what